Thank you, Bruins. As many of you are well aware, we have a special guest here today. And I just ask that you give him your undivided attention. This is not a time to communicate with your friends, to pull out your phone. This is a time to listen and learn. Bernat Rosner was born in 1932 in rural Hungary. His early life was shaped by the rigor and discipline of an Orthodox Jewish upbringing and a literate and sensitive mother. Overwhelmed by the Holocaust at the age of 12, he was the only member of his family to survive the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the other horrors of the Nazi concentration camps. Bernie came to the United States in 1948 at the age of 16 and received his education at Cornell University and Harvard Law School. He spent his 35-year career in the legal department of the Safeway food chain, the last 10, as the company's chief legal officer. After his retirement in 1994, he and his friend Fritz Tubach co-wrote a book, An Uncommon Friendship, which tells the unique story of two boys trapped on opposite sides of the Holocaust. Ladies and gentlemen, Bernie Rosner.
Hi, I am real glad to be here, and I want to thank Mr. Dwyer and the rest of the school staff for inviting me, and I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me and hopefully give me a chance to answer some of your questions. To me, it's always a special occasion when I have a chance to talk to young people. It's special for me, and I hope to you as well, for at least 3 reasons. The first is that when I ended up on the platform of the Auschwitz concentration camp, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Well, that's where my ordeal started. I was just a little over 12 years old. In other words, a couple of years younger than most of you here today. Now, I hope to goodness that nothing remotely as bad that has happened to me will ever happen to you. But as you live your life, I'm sure you will come across times when you are in a crisis, when you face problems that at first seem to be beyond your ability to cope with. And I hope my story will give you some inspiration in terms of dealing with those adversities that life throws on your way. The second reason is that I've just, quote, celebrated my 84th birthday. The obvious moral of the story of that is that it won't be much longer that Holocaust survivors will be around. You are probably the last generation who will hear that story from the mouth of somebody who actually lived through it. And I hope you agree with me that a story is more alive and understandable and meaningful when it's told by somebody than by just reading it out of a book. And the third reason is the fact that, notwithstanding all the bad things that happened so long ago, some pretty awful things are happening today. And we older folks haven't been able to deal with that and solve it. And it is really up to you people to do something to try to make sure that these things just don't keep happening over and over again. Basically, my story is of what racism, intolerance, and hate can do to a country and a society. And that is always relevant, and that's always important to keep in our mind. The only other thing I want to say before I tell the story is that much of the reason I'm here today is because another person and me wrote a book. And the other person's background could not have been any more different than mine. While I was a Jew raised in Europe, he was a German youngster raised in wartime Germany, and his father was a Nazi. We met about 40 years after all that happened in Orinda, California. And by then we both became Americans. We accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions, not for those of your race or nationality or in any other way, because you have been born or you were the offspring or descendant of somebody. You are yourself and you are responsible for your own action. We decided that we both had good stories to tell, and we decided to tell it together in a book that's called An Uncommon Friendship. I understand there is a copy of it here in the library, and I brought one with me. If you're interested, it can be also purchased in bookstores or mostly on Amazon. The rest of what I have to tell you is basically what happened to me, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up here talking to you this morning. I was born in a smallish town in rural Hungary. I don't know if you've looked at a map recently. It's basically in Eastern Europe, a long way from here. And when I was born, it was also very different. Life was very different than it is today. In our village, there was one car that belonged to the doctor and another one that belonged to the local landowner. The rest of us mostly walked by foot. We had no radios. In our home, we did not have indoor plumbing till we moved to a house when I was 10. But the fact was that I didn't miss all these amenities that we now have, and I had a basically happy childhood. All of that changed very dramatically and very suddenly on a specific day in March of 1944. I remember the day very well. I was just on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah. I assume you know mostly what bar mitzvah means. And as I was walking by near our house, a woman told me, a neighbor, "Have you heard the news?" And when I asked her what was the news, she told me that the Germans took over Hungary. I didn't realize what that meant at that particular time, but I found it out very quickly. Very soon after this news, and that day, March 19, 1944, things began to change in my life. A whole stream of anti-Jewish edicts started to come out from government authorities. First, Jews could not travel without some specific written permission, and soon Jews could not travel at all. About mid-April of that year, we were told that all Jews had to wear a yellow star on their outer clothing. I remember my mother, the evening before this edict went into effect, sewing the yellow stars on our outer clothing. By mid-May, all Jews were required to move from their homes and live in a ghetto. A ghetto means an enclosed place that you could not get out of without permission, and it was separated from the rest of the population. My family was pretty lucky in that respect because our home was in the area that was designated as the ghetto. But our three-room house that just was the home for myself, my parents, my younger brother, and myself, became the home of other relatives whose houses were outside the ghetto, and there were as many as 16 to 18 people in our three-room home. The end of the Jewish community in Tug came during the third week of June of 1944. On 24-hour notice, we were told to be out in front of our homes with one suitcase per person, ready to be relocated. That's what they called it, relocated. Three things stand out in my memory on the day that we were marched out of the ghetto to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude of the other people in our village. A few of them were out on the street yelling things like, "Well, you Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The vast majority of the townfolk went into their homes, pulled down their shutters, closed their windows to shut out the sight of their fellow citizens being marched down like cattle. The second thing I remember from that day was our stop at the local school of all places, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation, being stripped naked and hand-searched by Nazi thugs. The third was in the brickyard next to the railroad station, where there was just a bare earth for a floor, but the only thing we could sleep on was blankets that we brought with us. And that evening, an elderly woman, this was on a Friday, the onset of the Sabbath, and an elderly woman stood up to recite her prayers, and a guard with his rifle butt knocked her bloody and unconscious onto the ground. A lot worse things happened through my life at the concentration camps, but you must remember that until that day I had a relatively happy, quiet childhood, and to be steeped into this kind of nightmare all at once would leave an indelible impact on my memories. From my town and from the brickyard, we were then packed into freight cars, taken to an assembly point about 30-40 miles from where we lived, where we were joined by about 10,000 other Jewish people who were torn out of their homes, and we were then housed or camped on an open field with just rations, barely enough to keep us going, with no other facilities, waiting what will happen to us. We were in that open field for about 3-4 days, after which we were packed in another set of railroad freight cars, cattle cars. We were headed to a place we did not know where it's going to take us. After about 4 days being locked up in the cattle car, the sliding doors of the car were opened, and we were told brutally to get out of these cars. And I looked out and I saw a sign on the station platform saying Auschwitz. I didn't know what that meant, but that word has now become a symbol of all the horrible things that happened during the Holocaust. On the platform at Auschwitz, there was brutality, chaos, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, my kid brother, and I were still together. The first thing that happened was an announcement on the loudspeaker that all those who were in charge of each cattle car should report somewhere. My father was in charge of our car, so what he could do about being in charge, I never found out, and he never was told. But with that announcement, he left us, and I never saw him again. The next announcement was that men and women should separate because showers would be given. By this time, my mother was quite frightened and told us kids to stick with her. Being a 12-year-old, I said I wasn't about to take a shower with a bunch of women. She didn't argue with me, but her last words to me were, "Whatever you do, stick with your little brother." So she left us, and I never saw her again. The next thing that happened was that all the people on the platform, all the males, had to line up in a row. And as we were standing in a row, we saw that the head of the line were two German Nazi officers. And and as you got to the head of the line, these officers looked at you and sent you either to the left or the right. I didn't know what this was for, so as my brother and I were near the line, my younger brother, who was just a little over 10 years old, was the first. The Nazi looked at him and without any question and thought, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, I followed him. I was about 3-4 steps past where the Nazi was when he grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and looked at me and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I don't know whether he did this because he was angry that I made my own decision instead of waiting what to do, or whether he looked at me and thought, well, maybe this one we can get a little some work out of, and therefore we're gonna keep him for a while. In any event, that shove from the left to the right made the difference between my surviving that day and the rest of my family being killed in a gas chamber and thrown in a crematorium before that day was over. My ordeal did not end with that fateful shove. For every day, for the next 10 months, until I was liberated, it was a battle for survival. At first, the survival was literally to try to stay out of the gas chambers, because even though I passed that initial test when the Nazi shoved me over to the right, they kept screening people when they selecting them for work details. And I kept flunking those screenings because I was too small and too young. About 2 months after being in this camp, I realized that all those left in my camp were the old, the sick, and the weak, and young people like me who were not suitable for work. And while I didn't know exactly what would happen, I realized this was not a good place to be. So one day, as they were selecting a work detail to be taken out of our camp, I snuck into that work detail and was put on a train and sent to another camp called Mauthausen, which was in Austria. I think I'll just give you a typical day in Mauthausen to give you a feeling of what it was like to be in this kind of a camp. I'll start with the evening. We were in barracks, and we had bunks, not much larger than the kind of bunks that you used to sleep in or still do in your bedroom. But instead of being place to sleep for one person, it was crammed with 4 people. Obviously, we were pushing and shoving and trying to make ourselves as comfortable as we could, but obviously we could not do that. So I told my bunkmates that let's make a deal. You give me the blanket, the one blanket we had for the 4 of us, and I will go under the bunk and sleep there, and you could have a little more room. That was the kind of a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6 in the morning, and there was one faucet with cold water, and that was what we could wash our faces with. This was, by this time around October, in the northern part of Europe, and it was getting pretty cold. We were shoved out of the barracks, and we had to stand in line in rows to be counted for roll call, which they called an appel. We had to stand there and wait for the German who came by and got a report from the man, another prisoner who was in charge of our barracks, to account for all the people that were in the barracks. We had to do this every morning, whether it was rain or shine, cold or not so cold, and sitting and shivering or sometimes wet, waiting for the roll call. After the roll call was breakfast, which consisted of a brown, semi-warm, lukewarm liquid that was called coffee. After that, people were sent out to their various work details. Many times I was not picked to a work detail because I was too small, and by then was very thin. So we stood around outside. You could not go into the barracks in the cold. And often the Nazis and the overseers, just to enjoy themselves, took clubs and started beating us, and we huddled up together for warmth, and we were like a herd of cattle in stampeding, trying to escape from the clubs, being beaten. I got stomped upon, and I had a sore on my leg, which the scar of it is still there to this very day. Our lunch was a greasy liquid with made out of some beet or carrots, and I hope that this won't ruin your appetite for lunch. Often there were some bugs floating around in it as well. We got a bowl full of it, and that was our lunch. At first I couldn't touch the stuff, but if you're hungry enough, you'll eat almost anything. Evening meal was about a piece of bread. At first it was a quarter of a loaf of bread, but as the conditions got worse and food became scarcer, the quarter of a loaf became a fifth of a loaf. Pretty soon it was not much more than a slice. And the slice of bread came with either a piece of margarine or some jam, and that was your supper. That was basically our diet during the months that I was in the camp. By the time I was liberated by the Americans, all of these conditions, including the fact that we were totally riddled with lice. Our pastime was every night taking off our shirts and what we did is try to crack these lice. I don't know if you've ever seen any lice. They are little tiny creatures with a red dot in the middle, which is the blood that they sucked out of your body. We were cracking them with our finger. though we could never kill them all because they multiplied and made life miserable on top of everything else by being bitten by them and sore and all kinds of running sores at times. By the time I was liberated, all of these conditions and the fact that the lice and the other unsanitary conditions caused the illness called typhus, I lost consciousness and I woke up in an American field hospital where I was weighed, and at the age of 14, I weighed 23 kilos, which is roughly 56 pounds. I will finish by telling you what happened after the war and how a chance encounter changed my life forever. After the war, after liberation, we were in refugee camps, which were not obviously as bad as the concentration camps, but they were still pretty grim places. The living conditions were very poor, not enough food, the accommodations were poor, and you didn't have to worry about literally dying of being killed or dying from starvation or illness every day. Things were still not very pleasant. Next to the camp where we were was a quarter, some buildings where Americans were billeted. They were the only source of anything that could make our life better, like a piece of candy, and if we were really lucky, some food, a chocolate bar. So I hung out near these quarters where the Americans were, and one day as I was there, a Jeep drew up with 4 GIs, and I immediately ran up to the Jeep and offered my services as a porter. One of the GIs smiled and pointed to a duffel bag, which I picked up. And my employer, the GI who employed me later, told me that all he saw was the duffel bag and my bare heels underneath, clicking away with great energy, taking his duffel bag to his quarters. When I put down the bag, we tried to communicate, and we realized that our only means of communication was broken German. I, in a few words, tried to explain where I came from, what my situation was, and he was obviously very moved. From that day on, for the next 4 or 5 days, whenever he finished his work for the day, he came over, picked me up, and he took me to a restaurant, he took me movies, things that I have never had before. This book that we wrote, which I have with me and you have in the library, shows a picture of me, this urchin, next to the GI. This all was for only 4 days because he was transferred to another station and I was moved to an orphanage, which had a much more humane facilities. And I thought that this was just a bright, shining moment in my life, and I was back to the dreariness of what was then and what I could look forward to. But one day, I had a dream, and he was in it, and I decided I'd write him a letter. He left me his address. He wrote back, and this was about July of 1944. The war in Europe was over. He was sent back to the States. And in November of that year, he wrote me a letter saying that he never could get me out of his mind, and he wanted me to come to this country and be a member of his family. I decided, and I gratefully accepted this offer, and I ended up in the United States, going to a private school and learning English and ending up going to a university and Harvard Law School, and here I am. And I'm so glad to have a chance to tell you this story. We have just a little time left, I take it, for some questions, and I will try to answer them to the best of my ability.
I just want to say, first of all, many of you submitted, I looked at probably over 100 plus questions, and I was pleasantly surprised at the level of questions that you were asking Bernie. So, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And here, I can't ask all the questions, obviously, because we'll run out of time, but I will, oops, good catch. I'll make sure that we cover as many as we can. So, before you went to the camps, did you and your family try to go into hiding?
No, we did not, for a number of reasons. Until that fateful day, that I heard the news, we were in Hungary, and Hungary was an ally of Germany, and Hitler and the Germans let Hungary pretty much alone in terms of dealing with the Jews. So while there was a significant amount of anti-Semitism, there was not this horrible, destructive, murderous regime that the Nazis established. To say that we didn't know what was happening in other parts of Europe and would not be true. We did hear rumors, and I never will forget, shortly after the war broke out, which was quite a bit earlier, a man showing up in our village at our one of our prayer meetings, sobbingly told what happened to him and his family in Poland. We were absolutely devastated, and we're just feeling overcome with pain. But I have to tell you, our next thought was, thank God it's not happening to us. There was a great deal of denial. We just could not believe that something like that will ever happen to us. So we never tried to go, we never felt there was a need for us to go into hiding. But more equally important, by the time the bad stuff started happening, there was no way to go into hiding. You were guarded, you were in this ghetto, you could not get out. If you got out and they caught you, they killed you on the spot. So there was no opportunity to get into hiding or to escape by the time these awful things that I just told you happened.
What thing or things did you think about which helped you get through the horrible things you experienced there in the camps?
I was really, the answer to that is that I was so busy surviving through all the misery that I just described, the filth, the beatings, the hunger, the cold, that I did not have much thought about what is happening, what will come next. I just tried to basically survive from one day to the next.
At any time, did you ever give up hope?
No, I did not. I'm not religious today, but as I told you in my introduction, Mr. Dwyer said, I came from a very religious family, and I had deep belief that God will somehow help me and help us. And that hope did, in fact, sustain me throughout the time that I was in the camps.
Were there any times that you saw examples of humanity in the camps?
Yes, there were occasional instances of that. One was when I just briefly mentioned as how I got out of Auschwitz. there was no way for me to get into this work detail that got me out from the camp, the barracks that were almost certain would have been sent to the gas chambers. And this Nazi saw me basically sneak into this group of people that were being shipped out to a work camp. But he, instead of kicking me back, which he could have because he was right in front, he just let me go into the group that was sent out to camp. There were prisoners who were in the same awful situation that I was, but they were able, some of them displayed incredible acts of selflessness by sharing their very meager rations with others who had even less. I myself had a buddy whose shoes were stolen in the middle of the winter and would have had to go to work in barefoot through the snow and ice. And the man who stole his shoes came and told us that he can get his shoes back if we gave him a ration of our bread. And there was no way that he could survive without his shoes. So we split our ration. We gave him the ration to get the shoes back, and we split our rations. And to this very day, we correspond and remember when I saved his life. So there were acts of humanity, and sometimes even by the Nazis.
What was it like transitioning back into society after being liberated from the camps? What was, for example, was the most difficult part, or what surprised you?
For me, I was so relieved that I survived that I never, throughout this time, after the liberation, I was so focused on trying to make a new life for myself and feel so much relief that these things were over, that I did not spend much life feeling how difficult it is to transition. I just felt grateful that I survived. And I still do feel pretty much the same way.
I'm going to ask you just a couple of more questions as our time is winding down here. Do you ever get tired of answering questions which remind you about your experiences in the camps?
No, I don't. I think it's important to talk about your experiences. There was a time when I didn't do that for a number of reasons. It was just the memories were too difficult. But I think it's important to talk, to tell people a story, because, as I indicated, it does have relevance today, to make sure that nothing remotely like what happened will ever happen in our society, in our country.
Do you think about your experiences every day?
Not anymore, not anymore. For a long time, after I was liberated, I didn't want to think about it at all, and I tried to push that stuff out of my mind. And now to have a chance to talk to you, it gives me a chance to relive and to remember. And also, by the way, it's very important that I feel that I have an obligation to the family that I lost. There have been many, many stories about the Holocaust, but their story has never been told. And for me to have a chance to tell it is a feeling that I am discharging an obligation.
And I think this will be the final question, is how do we prevent something like the Holocaust happening again?
Well, I think that often these things happen, the society that produced the horrors, it happens gradually, and it isn't just a handful of butchers and criminals and psychopaths. The issue of how much the general population knew has never been answered. I am pretty well convinced that most Germans did not know the details of what happened, but I think when you start seeing signs of racism, of hatred, I think you have to be alert and you have to speak out. And I think that's the way to try to prevent it. People ask me, could it ever happen in this country? I don't think so. I really don't believe. We have a culture, we have a civilization that, and a constitution and a heritage of respecting other people's right, that I don't think it can happen, but we have to be on the lookout to make sure that it doesn't.
Okay. Thank you, Bernie.